This is TWiT.
I'm going to talk about one distillery today that is a Scottish distillery. It's Glenmorangie.
Love them.
Because I think now that you have that foundation, I can go poke on the details of what makes Glenmorangie such an unusual distillery, even in a land of unusual distilleries. Starting with its location, it's far up to the north. Nominally, it's a Highland whiskey, but they're almost at the Orkneys. They're so far north. When I went up that way, you go to Inverness first, and then you can drive about a half hour north out of Inverness to get to the Dalmore, which is a lovely place. And I talked about their weird stills and, some of the aspects of the Dalmore. The Glenmorangie is another 20 minutes further north, just past it's the village of Tain, although officially it's called the Royal Burgh of Tain on the Dornoch Firth. So that's a bay of water that faces into the North Sea.
That's the Royal Burgh of Tain.
The Royal Burgh.
The Dornoch North. I'm listening to a wonderful podcast series about the decline of civilizations. And he's talking right now about how the Romans just could never get into Scotland. They were just too vicious.
Well, this is, and you're literally talking about the area of the Picts.
Yes,
this is where the Picts live.
Yes.
And it was the Romans that named the Picts, and then they built a wall.
Yes. Like Hadrian's Wall.
That's
Hadrian's
Wall. That's as far as they're going to go.
They call it Pict has, you'll be glad to know, exactly the same etymology as picture, because of the war paint. These people, I think they painted themselves blue, as I remember.
That's the famous one, but the big evidence from the Picts is it's a sandstone part of the world, and so they carved a lot of stone, and they were into all of that sort of the Celtic knots. All of that comes from the Picts.
Cool.
In fact, the logo of Glenmorangie is this a piece of an interlocking swirls from what's called the Cadboll stone, which is more than 1,000 years old.
That is so cool.
The Picts predate the Viking invasion. They appear to have been associated with the Celts overall. They do like the ziggurats, their standing stones, that sort of thing. Yeah. And that particular part of Scotland was a bit of an unruly part. So there's evidence of
as opposed
liquor,
to the nicer, cleaner parts of Scotland that was just civilized and whatnot.
So there is evidence of liquor being produced in that area going back to the Middle Ages, mostly in documentation about crime, right? Illegal booze making in one form or another, and lots of records of that. The formal distillery comes in 1843 when a fellow by the name of William Matheson buys a farm and its adjacent brewery and wants to convert it to become a whiskey distillery. Now, he hasn't got a lot of money, so what he does is he buys 2 huge copper gin stills. Now, gin in the traditional fashion, in the pot still fashion, is typically distilled from grain with the botanicals right in the pot. And but in modern fashions, even in that time in the 1800s, they were starting to do high distillation of gin. So distill the grain separately and then soak it in the botanicals. Now, this is at the period where the coffee still has been invented. The Andreas Coffey over in Ireland had come up with this column still in the 1830s. And this is where it became much easier to make a 90% pure spirit, which was really good for gin. You do that, then you soak the botanicals in it, would pull the flavors out of it, then you cut it with water, gin. But Matheson hasn't got that kind of money. So the reason he's able to buy these giant gin stills cheap is they are flipping over to column stills. So he's going to make these into whiskey stills. And they call this a feature, actually. These stills are enormous. And they they don't use the original ones anymore. They have made every replacement still in the same form factor. They're over 5 meters tall. It's like 17 feet. These are massive machines. They call them the giraffes. And in fact, every year they celebrate World Giraffe Day. And World Giraffe Day, if you weren't aware, is June 21st. So, and that's the only thing they have to do with giraffes per se. Part of the side effect of being in a sandstone area, all that carving, is that actually the water's quite hard there. And normally when you're doing distillation, you want very soft water. We like limestone, not sandstone. So in the early days of whiskey manufacturing in that part of the world, One of the tasks you did in the off times each year was you climbed inside these giant stills with a hammer and chisel and scraped the lime scale off of the stills. Of course, obviously, in modern times, they have water softening equipment, so they don't have that much problem anymore. Also, because it's a distillery that's been around that long, they have clear records of when they converted from direct heat to steam heating of the stills, the modifications they made to put coils in the stills, to decrease that risk of explosion by not having open flame where you're boiling off alcohol. Funny like that. But they were part of that revolution as part of James Watt's steam stills and so forth. And in fact, with Glenmorangie, they were the very first distillery to convert to steam back in 1887. By the end of World War II, the Matheson family was getting on in years, and so they sold the distillery to MacDonald and Muir. These folks had been buying barrels and bottling to sell into the U.S. for many, many years. They're part of that organization, still exists. They make the whiskey known as Highland Queen, fine old Scotch, which you can still buy today, although it's made a totally different way today. They make it with blending of Tullibardine rather than being made from Glenmorangie. So MacDonald and Muir bought it because they were making they were the largest buyer of Glenmorangie at the time, blending it into their own whiskeys. And they found that a good business. So they also at that time bought Glenmorangie and Ardbeg down in the Islay. But otherwise, the facility is not massive. They have 14 aging buildings or 10 dunnage buildings. Those are the dirt floor, racked by threes style building. That's their main aging facility. They also have 4 rack rooms where they actually go higher. And all 14 buildings literally are right along the ocean. So part of their aging effect is exposure to salt. The salt water is right there. It's maybe 50 yards away from where the buildings are. Through those early days, they mostly sold to the U.S. They'd done very well in the U.S. markets. And so when Prohibition came along, things were bad for them. Now, remember, this is still at a time when you primarily shipped whiskey by barrel rather than by bottle. And so once the barrel houses are full and you can't sell enough barrels, it makes no sense to run the stills anymore. And so in 1931, they actually shut down. They mothballed the facility until Prohibition ended in 1936. They didn't know how long they would mothball. That's what they did. But the side effect of that, of course, is they got 5 years worth of aging in. So they were basically able to go ripping straight into business, except then, a couple of years later, Hitler invaded Poland and everything got complicated. And so now there were shortages of barley. So really, they didn't get into full swing again until 1948, where they were finally producing more whiskey than they were in the 1920s. They were very much a blending whiskey maker. That was their business. Being owned by MacDonald and Muir was part of that. So they didn't worry about making single malts until the 1970s when single malts became hipper. And so then they went down, started to make what they called the Signet line and tried a few different experiments that went fairly well for them.
I have to say I have a soft spot for Glenmorangie. My first whiskey that I tasted that wasn't kind of classic was their Portwood aged Glenmorangie, and it was amazing. I was in a movie theater and one of my buddies handed me a flask and I said, "What's this?" He said, "Portwood aged, baby."
Yeah,
so
good stuff.
Yeah.
No two ways about it.
Yeah.
They had one of the very first, the earliest tours that I know of that anywhere from the 1990s was Glenfiddich, but Glenmorangie had theirs in 1994, so they're right from the beginning as well.
That's probably about when that happened to me.
Yeah. In 2004, the MacDonald and Muir sold Glenmorangie and Ardbeg and Glenmorangie to LVMH. That's Louis Vuitton Moet Hennessy. They
own it all, baby. Yeah,
they own quite a bit, in conjunction with Diageo, and that's really when Glenmorangie. It's LVMH, so they're going to pivot towards sort of luxury brands. That's their shtick, and they became a bit of a laughing stock inside of the whiskey industry as a whole, because one of the things that happens when you're involved with Moet and Hennessy is you have access to a lot of weird casks. And so they got big on doing aging in wine casks and cognacs and so forth. So they made all kinds of interesting whiskeys that way. But in the meantime, they'd also made a deal to buy a lot of American bourbon casks. In the 80s, bourbon wasn't selling that well, and so they actually signed agreements with both Jack Daniels and Heaven Hills, which is in Bardstown, southern Kentucky, that they basically wanted exclusive rights to all the barrels. This agreement's changed since then, but they pretty much age everything in American bourbon, at least initially. And it's because of this agreement to buy tremendous numbers of bourbon casks. So they're kind of known as the wood wizards. Like they experiment with way more wood, different types, than most whiskey distilleries do. Their core range, this is probably the one you encountered, starts with what they call the original 10. So this is a pretty straight up bourbon aged whiskey from that barrel agreement that they've made with Heaven Hills and Jack to just age 10 years in bourbon. Their distillations are because their lie arms are so long, the stills are so big, they have a lot of reflux. So sulfurs are largely pulled out. There's a lot of copper involved there. So you kind of get a light, very mild bourbon or a whiskey that then is aged in these bourbon casks for 10 years. So it picks up a lot of bourbon character. And some folks complain it's a bit harsh that way. But then they did these core variations. So after you spent 10 years in bourbon, if you're happy with it, you put it in a bottle and call it Original 10. If you're not, then you put it into other barrels. And so Glenmorangie La Santa has that 10 years in bourbon, but then they put 2 years in sherry casks and then bottle it. And the Quinta Ruban is 10 years in bourbon and then 4 years in port barrels. And then the fourth of what they call the core ranges is one they call Nectar d'Or, or gold nectar, which is 10 years in bourbon and then 2 years in Sauterne casks. So that is a white dessert wine.
Very sweet and delicious. Yeah.
Yes, I don't mind Sauterne. I find the whiskey a bit odd.
Is it sweet?
It comes up a little sweeter. It has some funny notes in it. It's kind of perfumey. Not what I generally look for in a whiskey, but some folks like it. So those are the most common. Those are generally the ones you're going to find. They have another range called the Prestige range where they're doing much more traditional whiskey aging. Again, almost exclusively in bourbon casks, but that's your 18, your 24, your 25s and 30s. Pricey, hard to find. That's the Prestige range. And this is, again, the effects of LVMH. They've made these things they call private editions. They've only done 10 versions of this. The last one was in 2019, which they called Alta, which is Celtic for wild, because they used a wild yeast and they actually used Campbell barley. So that is barley from the region of the north of Scotland, which is not generally good barley growing territory. It's very odd and but unique, and that's what people like.
I love it that all these companies are experimenting, and it's
and Glenmorangie more than anybody. This latest set the latest set of stills and washbacks they build, they spent a lot more money on them because they put in a lot of cooling and temperature controls because they're going to experiment further. And so they're sort of arming themselves with an experimental laboratory. Again, a side effect of LVMH, they have this thing they call the Legend Collection. You will see the Legend Collection in airport duty free. So they've literally made a set of whiskeys designed to be sold in duty free. So they're found nowhere else. And mostly they are bourbon and then different kinds of wine caskings. And all of them I find somewhat suspect just because wine's alcohol level so much lower. The texture inside of the barrels are different. You can't put a solvent in there for very long and not really pull some harsh flavors out. But so they're tricky ones to buy. But there's a reason they sell them in airports. People will pay too much there.
Knowing you never buy your whiskey in an airport.
Well, especially when it's whiskeys that are made specifically for airports.
Airport whiskey.
You will find they almost never have an age on them because they tend to be very young.
And they say on the label, duty free.
That's it. That's literally how they're built.
It's like buying sushi in a supermarket.
It's buying sushi in the gas station, right? So knowing you like a cask strength.
I do. I love
Leo.
cask strength, yeah.
So there are relatively few cask strengths in Glenmorangie, but one addition comes from their limited range. It's called a star. Again, another Celtic word for journey.
Yeah.
And that's a cask strength, about 52%. The last time they made it was 2017. The time it was $100. Today, if you can find one, it's about $200. A purely aged bourbon cask.
That is
The
not
one
a
I pulled up
recommendation this week, though.
No, well, the one I pulled up is the one I like the most, which is the Quinta Ruban 14. $55. It spent 10 years in bourbon, 4 years in port. They originally, a few years ago, made a 12-year-old that I just don't think was as good. The 14-year-old is better. 46 ABV, which is kind of the magic number for very drinkable whiskeys. This is a winner. Like, you can't go wrong, right?
Yeah.
Like, you'll be this is probably what your friend had you taste.
Yeah.
For exactly that reason. It drinks super nice.
It was
for
so
a
long
reasonable
ago.
price.
It was so long ago. I wonder if it was before the LVMH acquisition. That was in 94, you say?
That was 2004.
2004. Yeah, I feel like this was prior to that.
Yeah, so it might have been one of the others. But they,
all I remember is Portwood Aged was the thing that was new to me, and boy, it was delicious. But I think this might bring back fond memories. I'm going to try it. Yeah.
Yeah, I get nothing bad to say about the Quinta Ruban. It's the one of all of the Glenmorangies, is the one I pick first, just because it won't make you sad. It's a good drink.
It won't make you sad. It's a pretty bottle.
Yeah, this is the rebranding. This is again an LVMH thing. There's a more traditional bottle styling, but you see the little waspy waist on it, the flare at the top, and the new text. They've kept the Campbell logo, which is good. No giraffes in sight. I'm happy about that.
Yeah.
But very modern.
So none of their older styles are still around, huh?
All of them are tricky to find. You won't find them in a Bevmo or a Total Wines. Yeah. You can find them in specialty shops. And there are definitely premiums. I think the 25 goes for $5,000 if you can find it.
Wow.
So, they just, you definitely have to, the one you just pulled up, the 18, that's the classic Glenmorangie look.
Yeah.
Right. With the text on the top, the age.
Yeah. This is, I think, closer to what I had.
That's very much a classic, but that 18 is a straight bourbon casking.
Okay.
They didn't do anything else with it, which is their usual.
Yeah. Yeah, I could taste the port. I was so surprised. It was like, what the heck? What have you done to my whiskey? Glenmorangie, though, still pretty good, even though they've been sold to the luxury brand.
That's what they've had 20 years of that. If things were going badly,
I guess
they wouldn't be doing as well as they are.
Yeah,
but they are. The trick with any of these is to know what do you like. I tend to be more of a traditionalist, and they make a line that appeals to a traditionalist.
Yeah.
Right. If you want to go exclusive, they make a line exclusive. If you're buying stuff in airports, they make a line for that.
Just for you. So they make a line just for you.
They have a choice there. And that's, that's good branding, really.
Yeah, the good news is you don't have to paint yourself blue to try it. You can just.
No, you really don't.
Go to your Bevmo. The Quinta Ruban, 14 years old. They have a link on their website to Reserve Bar. I don't know if that's UK only, but. Yeah, maybe
I found it in Bevmo for $55.
Nice,
and they'll deliver.
Nice.
So you can get it in the US at least.
I like Bevmo.
My nice liquor stores here in BC have it.
Yeah,
so it's often on my shelf.
Yeah, the closest I can get it is Prospect, Chillicoot, California. I don't even know.
Chillicoot.
I have no idea where they're talking about.
Sounds like a Pennsylvania place.
Project Chillicoot, Prospect, Chillicoot. Or Palm Point Drive, South Fernandina Beach. I don't know where these places are.